The sky was gray over Cambrai on the morning of November 30th, 1917. A lone Bristol F-two-B cut through the freezing rain, its engine droning as it pushed deeper into German territory. At the controls sat Lieutenant Andrew McKeever, a 23-year-old Canadian who had traded a quiet life as a bank teller for the most dangerous job in the war. Behind him, Second Lieutenant Leslie Powell gripped his Lewis gun, scanning the horizon through squinting eyes. The rain had finally stopped. Visibility was improving, and that was the worst possible news for a two-seater reconnaissance plane sitting 6 miles behind enemy lines. McKeever had just finished photographing German positions when a thunderous explosion erupted below them. An ammunition dump had detonated, sending columns of black smoke spiraling into the sky. Hundreds of German soldiers scrambled across the ground like ants, desperately trying to contain the inferno. McKeever's lips curled into a grim smile. He banked the Bristol lower, preparing to strafe the panicking troops with a few belts of ammunition. It would be a good stunt, he thought, something to take the heart right out of the poor Hun. Then he looked over his right shoulder. 4 German Albatros D-5 fighters hung in the air barely 100 yards away. Their black crosses gleamed against their painted fuselages. Behind McKeever, another 5 enemy aircraft were closing fast, cutting off any escape route back to Allied lines. 9 enemy fighters against 1 reconnaissance plane. A two-seater armed with a single forward-firing Vickers and a rear-mounted Lewis gun that most fighter pilots dismissed as nothing more than a mail-order toy. What happened next would last less than 3 minutes, and it would cement Andrew McKeever and Leslie Powell as the deadliest two-seater crew in the history of aerial warfare. If you find stories like this fascinating, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. We cover the most incredible, underreported moments from the history of warfare, and you do not want to miss what comes next. McKeever was born on August 21, 1894, in Listowel, Ontario, a small town about 100 miles west of Toronto. His father worked in agriculture, and young Andrew grew up with the practical, no-nonsense attitude that defined rural Canadian life. He was good with his hands, steady under pressure, and possessed an almost preternatural ability to see details that others missed. His future comrades would call him Hawkeye, a nickname that would prove grimly prophetic. When the Great War erupted across Europe in 1914, McKeever was working as a teller at a local bank. The conflict seemed distant at first, something happening on the other side of the world. But as the casualty lists grew longer and the calls for volunteers grew more desperate, McKeever felt the pull of duty that drew so many young Canadians across the Atlantic. In October 1915, he joined the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada, a Toronto militia unit with a distinguished history stretching back to 1860. Many historical accounts mistakenly claim that McKeever served as an infantryman in France, slogging through the trenches of the Western Front before transferring to aviation. But that is not what happened. McKeever remained in Canada, training and waiting, while his thoughts drifted toward the sky. The Royal Flying Corps was hemorrhaging pilots at an alarming rate. The life expectancy of a new aviator on the Western Front had dropped to just a few weeks. Trenches stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border in an unbreakable stalemate. But in the air, the war remained fluid, dynamic, and devastatingly lethal. For every RFC pilot who became an ace, dozens more were eliminated in their first combat missions, often before they could even identify what had attacked them. McKeever saw opportunity where others saw danger. In November 1916, he applied for transfer to the Royal Flying Corps. He sailed for England on the 25th and received his probationary commission as second lieutenant on December 5th. His aviation training began in January 1917 at the School for Military Aeronautics at Oxford, where he learned the theory of flight, aerial navigation, and the mechanics of the fragile machines that would carry him into battle. At Northolt, he learned to fly. The training aircraft were unforgiving, and the instructors were even more so. Any mistake in the air could be fatal, and the RFC had no patience for students who could not master the controls. McKeever did not simply pass. He excelled. By late April, he had graduated from Hounslow as a qualified pilot, ready for combat. But the aircraft waiting for McKeever was not what most new pilots expected. He would not be flying a nimble Sopwith Camel or a sleek SE-5, the single-seat fighters that captured the public imagination. Instead, he was assigned to No. 11 Squadron, which was just transitioning from the outdated Fe-2B pusher to a new machine that many in the RFC did not know what to make of. The Bristol F-two-B was unlike anything the Royal Flying Corps had flown before. It was a two-seater designed ostensibly for reconnaissance and observation work. But its designers had given it something that other observation aircraft lacked: the performance and firepower to fight back. The Bristol was powered by the Rolls-Royce Falcon engine, a 275-horsepower power plant that gave it a top speed of over 120 miles per hour, faster than many dedicated fighter aircraft. It could climb to 20,000 feet, maneuver aggressively, and absorb punishment that would have torn lesser aircraft apart. For armament, the pilot had a single Vickers machine gun mounted to fire forward through the propeller arc, synchronized to avoid shooting off his own blades. This was standard for fighters. But the Bristol's real secret weapon sat behind the pilot. The observer's position was armed with 1 or 2 Lewis guns mounted on a scarf ring, allowing the gunner to aim in almost any direction. The Lewis was a remarkable weapon, a light machine gun that used 97-round drum magazines and was air-cooled, making it perfect for aerial combat. It could pour out devastating volumes of fire, sweeping across the sky to engage enemies that the pilot could not reach. But among the elite fighter pilots of the RFC and the Luftstreitkräfte alike, the Lewis had a reputation problem. It was seen as a defensive weapon, something for observers to use while fleeing from real fighters. Fighter pilots looked down on the two-seater crews, viewing them as bus drivers hauling photographers around the sky while the real aviators dueled for glory. The Lewis gun to these men was little better than a mail-order rifle, something a civilian might buy from a catalog, rather than a proper weapon of war. McKeever would prove them catastrophically wrong. He arrived at No. 11 Squadron on May 28, 1917. The squadron was still learning how to use its new Bristol fighters, and the early results had been discouraging. Just 2 months earlier, on April 5th, Captain William Leaf Robinson had led a flight of 6 new Bristol F-2As on their very first combat patrol over Arras. Robinson was already famous as the first man to shoot down a German airship over Britain, earning him the Victoria Cross. He was supposed to be the face of the new Bristol, leading it to victory. Instead, the mission ended in catastrophe. The inexperienced crews, unsure of how to handle their unfamiliar aircraft, tried to form defensive circles when attacked by Manfred von Richthofen and Jasta 11. 4 of the 6 Bristols were shot down, and 2 of the survivors, including Robinson himself, were taken prisoner. The Germans mocked the new British aircraft, convinced it posed no threat. What they did not understand, and what the RFC was only beginning to discover, was that the Bristol's failure had nothing to do with the aircraft. The problem was tactics. The crews had flown their Bristols like observation planes, trying to protect each other instead of attacking. But the Bristol was not an observation plane. It was a fighter disguised as a two-seater, and it needed to be flown like one. McKeever understood this instinctively. When he climbed into his Bristol for the first time, he did not see a flying camera platform. He saw a weapon. Less than a month after joining No. 11 Squadron, McKeever drew first blood. On June 26, 1917, he was flying with 2nd Lieutenant E. Oak as his observer when they encountered a pair of Albatross D-5s, the sleek and deadly German fighters that dominated the skies over the Western Front. The Albatross was a single-seater with twin synchronized machine guns and the performance to hunt down almost anything the Allies could put in the air. Most two-seater crews would have tried to run. McKeever attacked. He threw the Bristol at the Germans with an aggression that caught them completely off guard. The first Albatross went down under his Vickers fire, destroyed in a spinning dive. The second fell out of control, smoking and tumbling toward the earth. 2 victories in a single engagement, achieved by a reconnaissance pilot who had been in combat for less than a month. It was just the beginning. On July 7th, McKeever and his observer, now Lieutenant Leslie Powell, knocked down 3 more German aircraft in a single day, 1 destroyed and 2 sent spinning out of control. Powell was the perfect complement to McKeever. A Bristol native with steady nerves and exceptional marksmanship, he manned his Lewis gun with the calm precision of a surgeon. While McKeever hunted with his forward-firing Vickers, Powell covered every angle the pilot could not see. Together, they were becoming the deadliest team in the sky. McKeever repeated his triple victory feat on August 5th, September 23rd, and October 31st. Each engagement added to his legend and proved what the Bristol could do in the right hands. He was promoted to captain in late October, but the promotion meant nothing to him compared to the work he did in the air. And then came November 30th, 1917. That morning, McKeever volunteered for a reconnaissance mission that would take him 60 miles from his aerodrome and 6 miles behind German lines. The weather was terrible, a pouring rain with clouds so low they seemed to scrape the ground. Any sensible pilot would have stayed in the mess, drinking tea and waiting for the weather to clear. But McKeever saw an opportunity. The Germans would not expect anyone to fly in conditions like this. Their fighters would be grounded. He could slip in, photograph his targets, and slip out before anyone realized he was there. He took off with Powell in the observer's seat, and they climbed into the murk. As they approached the target area, the sky began to clear. Patches of blue appeared between the clouds, and visibility improved to several miles. McKeever completed his reconnaissance, photographing the positions he had been assigned. Mission accomplished. Time to go home. That was when the ammunition dump exploded. The blast was massive, a pillar of flame and black smoke rising hundreds of feet into the air. McKeever banked toward the explosion, curious. Below him, he could see German soldiers swarming like ants, desperately trying to contain the fires before they reached more munitions. They were exposed and panicking, the perfect targets. McKeever told Powell they were going to make a strafing run. It would be risky flying low over enemy troops, but the opportunity was too good to pass up. A few belts of machine gun fire would sow chaos among the Germans and give McKeever another story to tell in the mess. He was just about to push the nose down when he caught movement in his peripheral vision. 4 Albatross D-5s were hanging off his right wing, close enough that McKeever could see the pilots' faces. How had they gotten so close without him noticing? It did not matter. 4 against 1, with a 2-seater against purpose-built fighters. The odds were bad, but McKeever had beaten worse. Then he looked behind him. 5 more aircraft were closing from the rear, blocking his escape route to Allied lines. He was 6 miles into German territory, surrounded by 9 enemy fighters, and completely cut off from any hope of reinforcement. Most pilots would have tried to run. The Bristol was fast, and if McKeever dove for the deck, he might be able to use terrain to break contact and slip away. It was the smart play, the textbook response to being outnumbered this badly. McKeever did the opposite. He turned into the attack. If you are enjoying this story, hit the like button and drop a comment below. This helps the channel grow and allows us to continue bringing you the untold stories of history's greatest warriors. The 4 Albatross fighters had expected the Bristol to flee. They were positioned to pursue, their pilots already anticipating a chase across the French countryside. Instead, they found the 2-seater roaring straight at them, with its Vickers blazing. McKeever's first burst caught the lead albatross dead center. Flames erupted from its engine cowling, and the German pilot had no time to react before his aircraft became a fireball. McKeever was already shifting his aim, pivoting the Bristol's nose toward the second fighter in line. Another burst, another kill. The second albatross spiraled downward, trailing smoke and debris. Behind McKeever, Powell had his Lewis gun hammering. The mail-order rifle that fighter pilots mocked was spitting death at nearly 600 rounds per minute, and Powell was putting every round exactly where it needed to go. A third albatross took his fire and disintegrated, its wings folding as the fuselage plummeted toward the earth. 3 German aircraft fell from the sky in the first 90 seconds of the engagement. The fourth albatross from the initial group broke away, diving to join the remaining 5 from the second formation. McKeever watched him go, then made a decision that defied all logic and every tactical principle he had ever been taught. He flew deeper into German territory, toward the enemy. The 5 surviving fighters were regrouping, their pilots stunned by the ferocity of the Bristol's attack. They had expected to swarm a helpless reconnaissance plane and add another easy victory to their tallies. Instead, 3 of their comrades were falling in flames while the 2-seater came at them like a bird of prey. McKeever punched through their formation, his Vickers chattering as he passed between the albatross fighters. The Germans scattered, momentarily confused by the Bristol's aggression. Powell took advantage of the chaos, pivoting his Lewis gun to track a fighter that crossed behind them. He fired a long burst, and the 4th German aircraft of the day went down, spinning out of control and disappearing into the clouds below. 4 victories in under 3 minutes. But McKeever was not finished. He pulled the Bristol around for another pass, ready to finish off the remaining fighters. His thumb pressed the firing button for his Vickers. Nothing happened. The gun was jammed. McKeever worked the cocking lever desperately, but the mechanism was frozen, perhaps damaged by the cold or fouled by debris. He glanced back at Powell, hoping the observer could cover him while he sorted out the malfunction. Powell's face told him everything. The Lewis gun was out of action, too, either jammed or completely out of ammunition. In the span of a few seconds, the most aggressive 2-seater in the RFC had become completely defenseless. German bullets were already smacking into the Bristol's fabric-covered surfaces. The remaining fighters had recovered from their shock and were now closing in for the kill. Without functioning weapons, McKeever had only one option left. He faked his own death. Throwing the Bristol onto its side, McKeever let the aircraft drop like a stone, spinning toward the earth in what appeared to be an uncontrolled death spiral. It was a desperate gamble. If the Germans saw through the ruse, they would follow him down and finish him off while he was helpless. But if they believed he was hit, believed the Bristol was a dead aircraft falling with dead men inside, they might break off the pursuit. The ground rushed up toward them, 500 feet, 300 feet, 100 feet. McKeever held the spin as long as he dared, watching the altimeter unwind with terrifying speed. At the last possible moment, perhaps 20 feet from the ground, he pulled out of the dive. The Bristol leveled off, its wheels nearly brushing the treetops. McKeever looked up, searching for the German fighters. They were gone. The ruse had worked. The surviving Albatross pilots had watched the Bristol spiral down and assumed their target was finished. They had turned for home, leaving McKeever and Powell alone in the sky over German-occupied France. But McKeever was not safe yet. He was still 6 miles behind enemy lines, flying at treetop level over hostile territory. German soldiers on the ground spotted the low-flying aircraft and began shooting. Rifle rounds cracked past the Bristol's wings, and at least one struck the fuselage. McKeever hugged the terrain, using every fold in the earth for cover. He followed a road, then a line of trees, keeping so low that anyone could have hit him with a thrown rock. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Every German soldier they passed was a potential threat, every farmhouse a possible machine gun nest. But McKeever's navigation was perfect, and his flying was flawless. He crossed the front lines and touched down at his aerodrome with the Bristol battered, but intact. 4 aerial victories in a single combat. 9 enemies engaged, 4 destroyed, the rest driven off or deceived into abandoning the pursuit. It was the kind of performance that fighter aces dreamed about, achieved by a reconnaissance pilot and his observer in a 2-seater that the Germans had dismissed as harmless. The Royal Flying Corps awarded McKeever the Distinguished Service Order for his actions on November 30th. Combined with the Military Cross he had already received and the bar that would follow in March 1918, he became one of the most decorated pilots in the RFC. But for McKeever, the medal was secondary. What mattered was the proof. The Bristol F-two-B was not a flying bus to be protected by real fighters. In the right hands, with the right tactics, it was as deadly as any aircraft in the sky. And the Lewis gun, that mail-order rifle that fighter pilots mocked, had accounted for nearly half of his victories. The engagement over Cambrai marked the end of McKeever's combat flying career. By December, he had accumulated 31 aerial victories, making him the highest-scoring Bristol pilot of the war and the leading 2-seater ace of any nation. His observer, Leslie Powell, had scored 19 victories of his own, 8 of them while flying with McKeever. In January 1918, McKeever was posted to England as an instructor. The RFC desperately needed experienced pilots to train the flood of new aviators arriving from training schools, and McKeever was too valuable to risk in continued combat. He spent the rest of the war teaching others how to fly and fight, passing on the lessons that had made him the deadliest 2-seater pilot in history. Powell continued flying and added to his victory total, eventually accumulating 19 confirmed kills. He survived the war and returned to England, where he lived out a quiet civilian life far from the skies over France. Number 11. Squadron, meanwhile, continued to prove the Bristol's worth. Other pilots adopted McKeever's aggressive tactics, treating their 2-seaters as fighters rather than reconnaissance platforms. By the end of the war, the Bristol F-two-B had become one of the most successful and respected aircraft in the RAF arsenal. Bristol fighters eventually equipped 13 squadrons on the Western Front, with others serving in Italy and the Middle East. They flew reconnaissance, artillery spotting, close air support, and light bombing missions, but they also fought. The type's aerial combat record was extraordinary, and losses were lower than for any other aircraft in comparable roles. A total of 4,747 Bristol fighters were produced through September 1919, 10 months after the armistice. The Lewis gun, too, shed its reputation as a mail-order toy. Gunners across the RFC and later the RAF proved that in skilled hands, the weapon was every bit as deadly as the synchronized Vickers that fighter pilots favored. The tactics McKeever and Powell pioneered became standard doctrine, with 2-seater crews learning to fight aggressively rather than defensively. The Germans, for their part, never forgot the lesson of November 30th. After Cambrai, they treated Bristol fighters with respect. The easy kills the Jagdstaffeln had expected never materialized. Instead, each engagement with a Bristol was a fight to the death, and the outcome was never certain. Manfred von Richthofen himself, the Red Baron, warned his pilots about the Bristol. He had learned firsthand that the aircraft was dangerous, and he instructed his men to approach 2-seaters with caution. Coming from the highest-scoring ace in history, the warning carried weight. When the war ended in November 1918, McKeever was still in England, still teaching. The Canadian government had begun organizing its own air force, and McKeever was chosen to lead its first combat unit. He was promoted to major and given command of No. 1 Squadron, Canadian Air Force, in January 1919. The new squadron was equipped with Bristol fighters, naturally. McKeever could not imagine flying anything else. He used a Bristol as his personal aircraft, the same type of machine that had carried him through 31 victories over the Western Front. The Canadian Air Force was a modest organization, nothing like the massive RAF it was modeled after. Canada had no need for a large air arm in peacetime, and the government was already looking to demobilize as quickly as possible. By early 1920, the CAF would be disbanded entirely, its aircraft sold off or scrapped. McKeever did not live to see it. After his secondment to the Canadian Air Force ended on August 16, 1919, McKeever left the military. He was just 25 years old, with a chest full of medals and a future full of possibilities. He returned briefly to Listowel, visiting family and friends, before taking a new position as general manager of the Mineola Airfield on Long Island, New York. Aviation was the future, everyone agreed. The skills McKeever had learned in combat could make him wealthy in peacetime, managing an airfield that would serve the booming civil aviation industry. He had survived hundreds of hours of combat flying, dueling with the finest pilots Germany could produce, dodging thousands of bullets, and walking away from dogfights that should have been fatal. On September 3, 1919, he was injured in an automobile accident. The injury seemed manageable at first. McKeever was tough, a veteran who had shrugged off worse. But something was wrong. A broken bone had not healed properly, and by late autumn, complications had set in. He was moved to Toronto, where doctors attempted to reset the bone and treat the infection that was spreading through his body. Andrew Edward McKeever, DSO, MC, and Bar, DFC, the highest-scoring two-seater ace of the Great War, passed away on Christmas Day 1919. He was 25 years old. The man who had survived the deadliest sky combat of the First World War was taken by a car accident and the medical limitations of his era. It was the kind of cruel irony that the war seemed to specialize in, claiming its heroes through random chance long after the fighting had stopped. McKeever is buried in Fairview Cemetery in Listowel, Perth County, Ontario. His grave is modest, as befitting a man who never sought glory for its own sake. He fought because it was his duty, excelled because it was his nature, and died far too young because fate is rarely fair. But his legacy endures. The Bristol fighter remained in RAF service for years after the war, and the tactics McKeever pioneered influenced aerial combat doctrine for decades. The idea that an observer's weapon could be as deadly as a pilot's, that a two-seater could fight on equal terms with single-seat fighters, became accepted wisdom precisely because McKeever proved it beyond doubt. Leslie Powell, his partner in those deadly skies, survived into old age. He rarely spoke about the war in later years, but those who knew him understood that the bond between pilot and observer, forged in those few minutes over Cambrai, never faded. They had trusted each other absolutely, communicated without words, and fought as a single organism rather than two individuals sharing an aircraft. That kind of connection does not come often in life, and it does not disappear with time. The Lewis gun, too, had its vindication. Far from being a mail-order toy, it proved to be one of the most versatile and effective weapons of the Great War. It served in the trenches, on naval vessels, mounted on motorcycles and armored cars, and, of course, in aircraft. During the Second World War, Lewis guns were still in use, defending ships against air attack, arming resistance fighters across occupied Europe, and seeing combat in theaters from the Pacific to the frozen steppes of Russia. No one called it a mail-order rifle anymore, or if they did, they said it with respect. The story of Andrew McKeever and Leslie Powell is, at its heart, a story about being underestimated. They flew an aircraft that was supposed to run from fighters, armed with weapons that were supposed to be defensive, performing missions that were supposed to be secondary to the real fighting done by single-seat aces. Every assumption was wrong. In the sky over Cambrai, on November 30th, 1917, a bank teller from Listowel and his observer from Bristol proved that courage, skill, and the right tactics could overcome any odds. They took on 9 enemy fighters and won so decisively that the survivors fled rather than continue the engagement. They did it in under 3 minutes with weapons their enemies mocked, in an aircraft designed for photography. And then they flew home, landed safely, and prepared to do it all again the next day. That is the legacy of the Bristol fighter. That is the legacy of the Lewis gun. And that is the legacy of Andrew McKeever, the Hawkeye of No. 11 Squadron, who saw what others could not and fought when others would have fled. If this story inspired you, subscribe to this channel for more deep dives into history's most incredible warriors. Share this video with someone who appreciates tales of courage against impossible odds, and leave a comment telling us which forgotten hero you want us to cover next. We will see you in the next one.